Hello and welcome back to Poor Man's Electronics Bench. In this part of episode 11 I am going to complete the restoration and reassembly of my Eico model 1140 series parallel RC combination box. Up to this point I refinished the front panel. I managed to get a little bit of the corrosion off of it, and I gave it a coat of two-part epoxy, which give it a nice durable finish over time. Hopefully will prevent any more corrosion oxidation from happening on the panel. And I'm going to go over my refilling of the paint in the stamping on the stenciling of this panel. I had a trial and error situation, and it was one of those best described as do not confuse activity with accomplishment episodes, because I basically had to get to a point where I had to go backwards in order to go forwards again. But we got a good coat of epoxy on there and a good fill on all the paint and the numbers. So I'm going to go over what I did to get to this point, but I am also going to chapter things so you could skip over if you don't want to see all the gory details of what happened in order to get to this point. And then after that I will go along finishing and completing the restoration and testing of the box. So if you're interested in this content for this item, please follow along, and I shall talk to you on the next part. And I'm moving to the slightly hazardous chemical part of the content for trying to remove what's on this panel. As you can see, it's got some oxidation or corrosion from something, and I was working at it with some acetone, and I have an old can which is never going to see kitchen use. This is going to get recycled soon, but I move things outside because I don't want to take a chance of any ignition source getting to this acetone. But I'm not sure if there's some sort of lacquer coating or what's going on at the outside of this panel. It seems to have some sort of a unwillingness to not get rid of everything very easily, but I'm trying to see if I can do this without any mechanical intervention. Like I said before, though, the nice thing about this is all the lettering and numerical values are stamped into this metal, so there's some leeway as far as cleaning things up. You don't have to worry about the content that's printed on there going away. Just that I'm going to try to see what process works best out of this as far as getting it cleaned up. There seems to be a grain running with the width of the panel. Finish. Seems that the acetone is removed and redeposited. A bit of something on there. Let me just try to put some on a rag and wipe it off and see what my progress is. Well, we're not at the point of having polished off the corrosion yet. It's still got a blotchy matte finish to it, so can possibly continue with this process, maybe with some light oil even. Try using some motor oil I have on standby here. Might help cut through the deposits on it. This looks like it's going to be either elbow grease or using something mechanical. Doing things manually will probably have the lowest effect of disturbing any of that stamped-in stenciling. There's still a little bit of that corrosion on it. This could be part of a process that I need to continue. Well, I'm going to do that off camera. I'm just going to keep on working on this thing. I suppose eventually I will cut through the corrosion by hand polishing it, so we'll come back to it when I make some progress. Okay, I'm back and here's the final result. I ended up taking a powered 8-inch wire wheel very lightly to it to try to cut through some of the crud, and that helped a lot. And then ended up using a wire brush like this, just side to side a little bit, and just aggressively in a couple little spots. I hit some corrosion around this 3.3 meg. Resisted it, I got rid of most of it, and there's a little corrosion on the edges here and there, but I'm not going to sweat it too bad. The next part of this is going to be to repaint stencils on the lettering as well as I can, and then I'm going to put an epoxy clear coat on the top of this just to make it a little more durable. So we're going to go through that, and I'll probably show a little bit of the repainting the stenciling, but then after that I'm just going to go ahead and go forward to finishing the project. I'm going to go over filling in the red Eico emblem with some Rust-Oleum brake caliper paint. That's a higher temperature paint that's pretty durable. And upside down. And shake it up pretty well. And I had some little makeup applicators where I just pulled the fuzzy tip off of to get a nice little sharp plastic point, and I use that to fill in the needed areas in the stamping with some red paint, which worked out fairly well. The nice thing about that paint is it does give a very durable application, and it will not be affected directly or easily by the solvent chemicals in the epoxy, which I found out later, which I'll hopefully give you a quick look of in a little bit. So basically I just sprayed a little paint inside the cap and then picked it up with that applicator tip and filled in the needed areas. I didn't try to wipe it off wet because that just caused smears. I figured the best thing to do would just be to use some sort of sanding media on a sanding block, some sandpaper, which worked out fairly well. It did take off the paint off the high spots without affecting what was in the stamping. And this section of video shows my first attempt at the epoxy coating. I have the panel which I filled in the black part with the fine point Sharpie marker, and the red Eico stamped in portion is done with the Rust-Oleum caliper paint, and looks fairly attractive. And this, I had a really nice finished version on that. And then the epoxy that I used, I found a epoxy that was the low VOC, very low odor. It supposedly could be used indoors, but even using it outdoors, I didn't smell much of a volatile chemical content to be worried about it. And I just made some little spacers out of some toilet paper, to some sections of a toilet paper roll, to keep it from sticking onto a surface that it was going to be painted above, which is a lawn and leaf bag. I warmed that epoxy up in some water I took in a microwave that was just below boiling, and let it warm up for a good 15-20 minutes. That definitely helps with the mixing. And then a nice disposable foam brush comes in handy with these. And then I made up some little mixing stirring sticks. I just made sure that the epoxy really wasn't that fussy as far as one needing an exact one-to-one mix. I mixed it by eye, and it came out fine. It set up well within being handled within 24 hours. And the biggest concern is just to keep dust and dirt from falling on, dust, dirt, or bugs from falling onto it before it sets up. So you want to keep it covered for probably a good 24 hours just to make sure. So I took a small portion of that in a disposable little mixing cup, which I bought a bunch of. At this point, I did not realize that this epoxy was going to make that black Sharpie ink run as bad as it did. So this is a portion of doing some work where like I said, I had to go backwards in order to fix my mistake, and took a little more time because of using paint on everything. I also had to waited a good week for that paint to dry just to make sure I didn't have the same issue. And this epoxy seems to apply fairly easily and nicely with the foam brushes that I used. If there's any concern for bubbles getting stuck into the surface, let's see afterwards, I don't know if I show up, but I did use a electric heat gun on low just to warm up the epoxy after I painted it on the panel, just to make sure that the bubbles came out. And for the most part they did. I ended up with only some very small discernible bubbles, and one portion I had a fisheye in, so that means I didn't clean. Even though I thought I cleaned the panel off fairly good with a wipe of brake cleaner and a rag, I apparently did not, and must have had some sort of chemical on there causing one portion to not stick well. But it was just one, maybe not even an eighth of an inch fisheye type indentation in the epoxy, which really isn't going to be of a concern. And applying it's pretty straightforward. You just want to give it a nice even coat. Make sure you've mixed up enough epoxy. The first try I mixed up a little more than I needed, so on my second effort I did a little better as far as not mixing up too much and having too much waste. The nice thing about having some of that disposable cup is keep that cup handy, because if you are going to be letting that item sit up in a spot where you're not going to be close to it, you can keep that cup handy and check on it and see how it's actually setting up, because that epoxy in the cup is going to be the same consistency and mix as what you're putting on your item that you're refinishing, so it'll let you know when it's set up well, so you can go out and handle it. It wasn't apparent right away that the epoxy was going to cause issues with that Sharpie ink, but I will show you the result of that in a bit. And I'm overdubbing this because I had my neighbor out next door in her pool and she wasn't too far away, and I didn't want her to think of the fact that I was more of a crazy person than I actually am by talking to myself and doing work like this outside. So I think I got a good even coat of epoxy on everything. And at this point, this is the actual equivalent of watching paint dry, so I'm going to going to cut away from this and then go off to what it looked like after I let things set up for a while and came back out to check it. And this is definitely the trial and error portion of the episode. So you can see that after a couple hours that epoxy chemicals just worked on that ink in the Sharpie and made it bleed all over the place. Did not affect that caliper paint at all. So I was kind of surprised and pleased at that part. But at this point I knew that I just had to go and refinish it, which is really sad because the efforts up to that point were pretty good. But lesson learned. I definitely would advise using some sort of good drying enamel paint. That Rust-Oleum, both the caliper and the engine enamels worked fairly well. And going backwards at an occasion like this requires that you have some chemicals at hand, and one thing I did have was some epoxy solvent. And since that epoxy did not set up for a long period of time, it was only a couple of hours after I mixed it and applied it, I was able to easily remove what was on there, and the solvent did take off some of the paint, so I had to come back and do another attempt at resurfacing it and recoloring everything. But that's part of a learning process. And here is the refinished painted version of things. I just had to make sure I got enough paint inside of all the little nooks and crannies on the black, along with re-stenciling the red. There's the Rust-Oleum caliper paint. I had to give it a pretty generous slathering of, just to make sure I got good coverage inside everything that's in the stamped areas. It turned out fairly nice, I think. It definitely was going to not have an issue with the bleeding that the Sharpie ink had on my first try. Just had to take my time, and I just chose to not do the serial number because it might have been something that was stamped on after the actual production. So, and then that is the finished product before putting a new coat of epoxy on it. I think I took a look at the can just to make sure the drying time for handling, I think, might have been a couple hours, but I still let it sit for about a whole week, at least a whole week, just to make sure. I did not want to take a chance at that paint running at all. And I am back outside during a nice warm humid summer afternoon. I painted this about 10 days ago. Tried my best to let the paint harden for a while. I'm going to try to take all the high spots off with some 600 grit sandpaper and a small wooden sanding block. My goal is to just get the flat portion of the paint off without disturbing the paint that's set into the stamping. And we'll see how things go. It's fairly good. We're going to see how things are going. I heated up my epoxy. Have to mix some up. It's kind of nice that since I've done this before, I know that I can mix up a little less. The cure time on this is 24 hours, so I'm going to need to make sure this doesn't get knocked around in the process. Another good trick I found with mixing up epoxy for something like this is whatever cup you mix it in, don't throw that cup right away. Keep it handy, because you can kind of keep an eye on how well your epoxy is set up in the course of doing the work without having to disturb the workpiece. Get this phone up a little higher here so I'm not interfering with my brush strokes. Same thing as last time, a disposable foam brush. And it doesn't take a lot. I just mixed up a small quantity in disposable cup. Oops. I knew the phone was going to be in the way. And we're not trying to put like a real thick decoupage coat or anything on here. We're just a nice level amount to protect the panel.
I'm just going to hope that this doesn't lift and blister the paint like it did on my last attempt, but it wasn't paint, that was marker ink that it disturbed, so it's hoping for a better outcome this time. Seeing that it didn't disturb the red paint, and I'm using a similar paint for the black. Yeah, it looks like we've got a good even coat of epoxy and everything. Again, I'm going to use a heat gun because the epoxies always have a little bit of air bubbling going on with them. Just by heating them up with the torch or a heat gun helps pop the bubbles and level everything out. I've got some small pieces of stuff in there. Gun definitely helps level out any bubbles you have. That was just on low. Oh, zoomed in too much there. See, the surface has a nice level coating to it. And now my only other thing is to keep this from getting disturbed by anything, so I'm going to put her under glass. Oh, it don't fit. I thought it would fit in there, it doesn't. It's just a little too big. Well, I'm going to just have to put this out of the way someplace that it's less dust can get on it, cover it up, and then...
I am going to end part 2 here and create a part 3 to cover the final parts replacement and reassembly and testing of the Eico 1140 combination box. So if you're interested in the content on part 3, please look for the new upload. And I thank you for viewing this one, and please feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content and would like to see more content like this. Thank you. This content is available on YouTube and Odyssey.com. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Hope you return soon.